1:49 in the morning. I was just leaving the base when my phone rang. It was my mother. She was sobbing, her voice a breathless, terrified wheeze. "Your husband called me a crazy old woman," she gasped out. "Then he beat me with a baseball bat." 20 minutes later, I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the Atlanta police precinct. The entire room went silent. The desk sergeant looked up with a bored expression that quickly melted into sheer panic. His face went completely white. "Ma'am," he stammered, holding his hands up, "please, let me explain." I did not ask for an explanation. I looked straight past him to the holding area. There, sitting at a detective's desk with his feet propped up and a fresh cup of coffee in his hand, was my husband Marcus. He was not in handcuffs. He was not in a holding cell. He was chatting with a patrol officer about the upcoming Falcons game, wearing his custom-tailored Tom Ford suit. The only thing out of place was the unmistakable spray of crimson blood on his crisp white collar. "Valerie, baby, you really did not need to come all the way down here," Marcus said, offering me a smooth, practiced smile. "It was just a little misunderstanding. Your mother got confused again. She tripped on the stairs at the house. You know how her memory has been lately." I walked slowly toward the desk. The desk sergeant stepped in my path, offering a sympathetic, patronizing smile. "Now, Mrs. Jenkins," he began. "Your husband is a highly respected developer in this city. We sent a squad car to the house, and there are no clear signs of a struggle. It seems the elderly woman simply had a fall. We cannot just arrest a prominent businessman on the confused ramblings of a senior citizen. Why don't you take him home and let everyone get some sleep?" I did not yell. I did not cry. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket, pulled out my solid brass identification shield, and slammed it down onto the metal desk with a force that made the coffee cups rattle. "Major Valerie Jenkins," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Criminal Investigation Division, United States Army. You say there are no clear signs of a struggle. Sergeant, there is literal blood on his collar. But more importantly, the vehicle he used to drive away from the scene, the black SUV parked right outside your window, is a federal military vehicle assigned to my unit. He used federal property to flee an assault. That means this case just bypassed your entire jurisdiction." The sergeant stared at the badge, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Marcus dropped his feet from the desk, his smug smile finally faltering. "Are you out of your mind?" Marcus hissed, standing up. "You are going to use the military to lock up your own husband over a scratch. You are going to ruin my reputation over this." The sergeant reached nervously for his radio, murmuring that he needed to call his captain. But before he could even press the button, the precinct doors burst open again. "Stop right there," a voice commanded. I turned around and felt the air leave my lungs. It was my mother, Beatrice. She was leaning heavily on a cane, a thick white bandage wrapped around her forehead, her left eye swollen completely shut. But she was not looking at Marcus with fear. She was looking at me with absolute fury. Beside her stood my older sister Chloe, immaculate in a designer trench coat, carrying a Birkin bag, as if she were walking a runway rather than entering a police station at 2 in the morning. And hovering right behind them, practically guiding my mother by the shoulder, was Chloe's husband, Preston. Preston was a wealthy white venture capitalist who loved to play the ultimate savior for our family, always dressed in casual cashmere, always looking down his nose at everyone else. "Mom, what are you doing?" I asked, taking a step toward her. "I already called the medics for you." "I do not need medics, Valerie." My mother snapped, her voice trembling, but defensive. "Marcus is right. I fell. I tripped on the rug near the staircase. I was disoriented when I called you. Withdraw your complaint immediately." I stared at her, trying to process the absolute betrayal unfolding in front of my eyes. "Mom, I heard you on the phone. I can see the shape of the bruising on your face. You do not get a perfectly cylindrical contusion from a flat staircase." Chloe stepped forward, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "You always have to ruin everything, don't you?" she sneered. "You could never stand to see anyone else succeed. Marcus is about to close the biggest real estate deal in Atlanta. He and Preston are merging their portfolios next week. They are building an empire for this family, establishing true black excellence in this city, and you are trying to throw your own husband in jail over a clumsy accident. I looked at Marcus. He had regained his composure and was now looking at me with a triumphant smirk, crossing his arms over his chest. He knew he had them exactly where he wanted them. Preston sighed loudly, stepping in front of Chloe and giving me a look of deep, patronizing pity. "Valerie, let us be reasonable here," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Do not act like an angry black woman right now. Do not be impulsive. You are a government employee. You live on a rigid salary. You do not understand how high-level capital works. Your family needs my financial backing, and they need Marcus's community connections to break into the upper echelon of this city. You are jeopardizing millions of dollars. Be a good wife, sign the release forms, and let us all go home." The sheer audacity of the white man telling me not to be an angry black woman while he actively covered up the assault of my mother was almost dizzying. But the military had taught me one thing above all else: never strike when you are outnumbered and outmaneuvered. You retreat, you gather intel, and you wait for the perfect kill shot. I looked at my mother. She refused to meet my eyes, staring stubbornly at the floor tiles. The reality was sickeningly clear. Preston had paid off my mother's secret gambling debts years ago. He owned this family. He owned Chloe, he owned my mother, and now he owned my husband. They were willing to sacrifice my mother's physical safety just to keep the money flowing. "So this is it," I said, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. "You are choosing a fraudulent empire over your own blood. You are choosing a man who beats you just so you can pretend to be elite." "I am choosing the future of this family," my mother retorted fiercely. "Something you never cared about when you ran off to play soldier. Give the sergeant your badge and apologize to your brother-in-law." I stared at her for the long, silent moment. I slowly reached down, picked up my gold CID badge, and slid it back into my jacket pocket. I turned to the desk sergeant, who was sweating profusely, eager to be done with this nightmare. "Cancel the federal hold," I told the sergeant. "The victim refuses to cooperate. There is no case here tonight." Chloe let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief. Marcus chuckled, adjusting his suit jacket. "I knew you would come to your senses, baby," he said smoothly. "I will have my assistant send a car for you in the morning." I walked past my mother without a word. I walked past Chloe, who rolled her eyes. But as I passed Preston, I stopped. I leaned in close, bringing my face just inches from his ear, lowering my voice so only he and Marcus could hear. "You are right, Preston," I whispered. "I am just a government employee. I do not understand how venture capital works. But I do understand federal audits. For instance, I was just looking at Marcus's real estate fund today. I noticed it received a very sudden, very quiet injection of exactly $4.5 million. Funny thing is, that matches the exact amount of money that went missing from a Department of Defense veteran housing grant 3 weeks ago." Preston went entirely rigid. The smug, superior smile vanished from his face instantly. I saw his Adam's apple bob as he swallowed hard. I took a step back, maintaining direct eye contact with my husband. Marcus was no longer smiling. He looked like he had just seen a ghost. "You guys enjoy your merger," I said loudly, putting on a bright, cheerful smile. "Oh, and Marcus, make sure you wash that shirt. Federal blood spatter is notoriously hard to get out of high thread count cotton." I turned and walked out of the precinct, the heavy doors swinging shut behind me. As I stepped out into the humid Atlanta night air, I pulled out my phone and accessed the precinct's exterior security camera feed through my clearance portal. On my screen, I watched the immediate aftermath inside the lobby. Preston had grabbed Marcus by the collar of that expensive suit, shoving him against the front desk, his face red with sudden panic. Marcus was frantically pulling out his cell phone, his fingers flying across the screen. My own phone buzzed a second later. My team back at the base had intercepted the text Marcus just sent to his lead accountant. "Wipe the servers. Now. She knows about the veteran funds." I smiled, unlocking my armored SUV. They thought they had won because they got to walk out of a police station. They had no idea they had just walked right into a federal trap. The battle for my family's soul was over, but the war for their total destruction had just begun. My phone buzzed at 1:49 in the morning with a call that would destroy my marriage and expose my family's darkest secret. It was my mother sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. "Your husband called me a crazy old woman," she gasped. "Then he beat me with a baseball bat." The line went dead. I did not hesitate. I threw my tactical jacket over my shirt and practically flew out the door. The drive through the empty Atlanta streets was a blur of streetlights and pure adrenaline. 20 minutes later, I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the Atlanta police precinct, expecting to find him in handcuffs. Instead, he was sipping premium coffee at the sergeant desk. The entire room went silent when I walked in. The desk sergeant looked up, and his face went completely white. "Ma, and please let me explain," he stammered. I did not ask for an explanation. I walked straight past the front desk toward the holding area. Marcus was sitting there in his custom-tailored Tom Ford suit with his feet propped up on a metal chair. He was laughing with a patrol officer about the upcoming Falcons game. He was not in a holding cell. He was not even restrained. The only thing out of place on my 34-year-old husband was the unmistakable spray of crimson blood on his crisp white collar. "Valerie, baby, you really did not need to come all the way down here," Marcus said. He offered me that smooth, practiced smile that won him millions in real estate deals. "It was just a little misunderstanding. Your mother got confused again. She tripped on the stairs at the house. You know how her memory has been lately." The desk sergeant stepped into my path with a patronizing smile. "Now, Mrs. Jenkins," he began, "your husband is a highly respected developer in this city. We sent a squad car to the house and there are no clear signs of a struggle. It seems the elderly woman simply had a fall. We cannot just arrest a prominent businessman based on the confused ramblings of a senior citizen. Why do you not take him home and let everyone get some sleep?" I did not yell. I did not cry. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and pulled out my solid brass identification shield. I slammed it down onto the metal desk with a force that made the coffee cups rattle. "Major Valerie Jenkins," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Criminal Investigation Division, United States Army. You say there are no clear signs of a struggle, Sergeant. There is literal blood on his collar. But more importantly, the vehicle he used to drive away from the scene is the black SUV parked right outside your window. That is a federal military vehicle assigned to my unit. He used federal property to flee a violent assault. That means this case just bypassed your entire jurisdiction." The sergeant stared at the badge. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Marcus dropped his feet from the desk and his smug smile vanished. "Are you out of your mind?" Marcus hissed as he stood up. "You are going to use the military to lock up your own husband over a scratch. You are going to ruin my reputation over this." The sergeant reached nervously for his radio, murmuring that he needed to call his captain. But before he could even press the button, the precinct doors burst open again. "Stop right there," a voice commanded. I turned around and felt the air leave my lungs. It was my mother, Beatrice. She was leaning heavily on a cane. A thick white bandage wrapped around her forehead and her left eye was swollen completely shut. But she was not looking at Marcus with fear. She was looking at me with absolute fury. Beside her stood my older sister Chloe, immaculate in a designer trench coat. She carried a Birkin bag as if she were walking a runway rather than entering a police station at 2 in the morning. And hovering right behind them, practically guiding my mother by the shoulder, was Chloe's husband Preston. Preston was a wealthy white venture capitalist who loved to play the ultimate savior for our family. He was always dressed in casual cashmere and always looked down his nose at everyone else. "Mom, what are you doing?" I asked, taking a step toward her. "I already called the federal medics for you. I do not need medics, Valerie," my mother snapped. Her voice was trembling but defensive. "Marcus is right. I fell. I tripped on the rug near the staircase. I was disoriented when I called you. Withdraw your complaint immediately." I stared at her, trying to process the absolute betrayal unfolding in front of my eyes. "Mom, I heard you on the phone. I can see the shape of the bruising on your face. You do not get a perfectly cylindrical contusion from a flat staircase." Chloe stepped forward and pointed a manicured finger at my chest. "You always have to ruin everything, do you not?" she sneered. "You could never stand to see anyone else succeed. Marcus is about to close the biggest real estate deal in Atlanta. He and Preston are merging their portfolios next week. They are building an empire for this family. They are establishing true Black excellence in this city, and you are trying to throw your own husband in jail over a clumsy accident." I looked at Marcus. He had regained his composure and was now looking at me with a triumphant smirk. He crossed his arms over his chest, knowing he had them exactly where he wanted them. Preston sighed loudly. He stepped in front of Chloe and gave me a look of deep patronizing pity. "Valerie, let us be reasonable here," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Do not act like an angry Black woman right now. Do not be impulsive. You are a government employee. You live on a rigid salary. You do not understand how high-level capital works. Your family needs my financial backing, and they need Marcus community connections to break into the upper echelon of this city. You are jeopardizing millions of dollars. Be a good wife, sign the release forms, and let us all go home." The sheer audacity of this white man, telling me not to be an angry Black woman, while he actively covered up the violent assault of my mother, was almost dizzying. But the military had taught me one thing above all else. Never strike when you are outnumbered and outmaneuvered. You retreat, you gather intel, and you wait for the perfect kill shot. I looked at my mother. She refused to meet my eyes and stared stubbornly at the floor tiles. The reality was sickeningly clear. Preston had paid off my mother's secret gambling debts years ago. He owned this family. He owned Chloe, he owned my mother, and now he owned my husband. They were willing to sacrifice my mother's physical safety just to keep his money flowing. "So this is it," I said, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. "You are choosing a fraudulent empire over your own blood. You are choosing a man who beats you just so you can pretend to be elite." "I am choosing the future of this family," my mother retorted fiercely. "That is something you never cared about when you ran off to play soldier. Give the sergeant your badge and apologize to your brother-in-law." I stared at her for the long, silent moment. I slowly reached down, picked up my gold badge, and slid it back into my jacket pocket. I turned to the desk sergeant, who was sweating profusely and eager to be done with this nightmare. "Cancel the federal hold," I told the sergeant. "The victim refuses to cooperate. There is no case here tonight." Chloe let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief. Marcus chuckled and adjusted his suit jacket. "I knew you would come to your senses, baby," he said smoothly. "I will have my assistant send a car for you in the morning." I walked past my mother without a word. I walked past Chloe, who rolled her eyes. But as I passed Preston, I stopped. I leaned in close, bringing my face just inches from his ear. I lowered my voice so only he and Marcus could hear. "You are right, Preston," I whispered. "I am just a government employee. I do not understand how venture capital works. But I do understand federal audits. For instance, I was just looking at Marcus' real estate fund today. I noticed it received a very sudden, very quiet injection of exactly $4.5 million. Funny thing is that matches the exact amount of money that went missing from a Department of Defense veteran housing grant 3 weeks ago." Preston went entirely rigid. The smug, superior smile vanished from his face instantly. I saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. I took a step back, maintaining direct eye contact with my husband. Marcus was no longer smiling. He looked like he had just seen a ghost. "You guys enjoy your merger," I said loudly, putting on a bright, cheerful smile. "Oh, and Marcus, make sure you wash that shirt. Federal blood spatter is notoriously hard to get out of high thread count cotton." I turned and walked out of the precinct, the heavy glass doors swinging shut behind me. As I stepped out into the humid Atlanta night air, I pulled out my phone and accessed the precinct exterior security camera feed through my military clearance portal. On my screen, I watched the immediate aftermath inside the lobby. Preston had grabbed Marcus by the collar of that expensive suit, shoving him against the front desk. His face was red with sudden panic. Marcus was frantically pulling out his cell phone, his fingers flying across the screen. My own phone buzzed a second later. My cyber team back at the base had intercepted the text Marcus just sent to his lead accountant. "Wipe the servers now. She knows about the veteran funds." I smiled and unlocked my armored SUV. They thought they had won because they got to walk out of a police station. They had no idea they had just walked right into a federal trap. The battle for my family's soul was over, but the war for their total destruction had just begun. I pulled out of the precinct parking lot and drove my armored SUV straight into the suffocating humidity of the Atlanta dawn. I did not go to the base. I went straight to the sprawling Buckhead estate Marcus and I had shared for 3 years. I knew exactly how men like him operated when they felt cornered. They try to strike first to establish dominance. I pulled into the circular driveway and saw Marcus standing on the grand portico. Beside him was a man in a cheap suit holding a thick manila folder. Through the frosted glass of the front double doors, I could see the silhouette of my mother Beatrice. She had come straight from the precinct to stand guard over her new favorite son. I walked up the sweeping brick stairs. When I reached for the digital keypad to unlock the front door, the light flashed a harsh, angry red. Access denied. Marcus smirked and adjusted his cuffs. "You are locked out, Valerie," he said, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "I changed the security codes the minute I left the station. The joint bank accounts are frozen too. This gentleman here is my attorney. He is serving you with emergency divorce papers citing severe emotional instability and paranoid delusions." My mother stepped out onto the porch, crossing her arms over her chest. She looked at me with cold, empty eyes. "You brought this on yourself, Valerie," my mother said. "A good woman stands by her husband. You chose to act like a lunatic, so now you get to leave with exactly what you brought into this marriage. Nothing." The attorney shoved the manila folder into my chest. He told me I had 30 days to contest the filing, but advised me that Marcus had already petitioned for a restraining order. They wanted to paint me as an unhinged military veteran who had lost her mind. They thought if they cut off my money and my home, I would be too busy fighting for survival to dig into their fraudulent empire. I did not shout. I did not drop a single tear. I calmly took the folder and walked back down the stairs to my military-issue SUV. I popped the heavy reinforced trunk. Inside, there were no golf clubs or designer shopping bags. There was a mobile military-grade server rack blinking with green and blue encrypted lights. "Marcus," I said, resting my hand on the steel bumper, "you locked me out of a house with a fresh coat of paint. But 20 minutes ago, my cyber unit locked you out of every offshore shell company you and Preston set up in the Cayman Islands." The smug attorney suddenly pulled his vibrating phone from his pocket. He stared at the screen and his face drained of all color. He looked up at Marcus with pure panic. He stammered that the law firm retainer Marcus had just wired them had bounced. The accounts did not just read zero, they read frozen by federal mandate. I slammed the trunk shut. I told Marcus he might want to find a cheaper lawyer because public defenders were the only ones who took clients with seized assets. I drove away, leaving them standing frozen on the pristine porch. I headed straight to the Criminal Investigation Division headquarters. My team was already waiting in the secure briefing room. We pulled up the financial webs Preston and Marcus had spent years weaving. It was a masterpiece of corporate deceit disguised as progressive social mobility. Preston was the true puppet master. He was a white venture capitalist who needed a black-owned business front to qualify for massive federal minority grants and veteran housing subsidies. He used Marcus as the token face of the operation. Marcus got to play the wealthy black elite in Atlanta society, while Preston funneled millions of taxpayer dollars into private accounts. But the most sickening discovery was not the corporate fraud. It was the personal betrayal. My lead forensic accountant pulled up a series of wire transfers dating back 5 years. They were massive payments made to underground casinos and illicit bookmakers. The debts belonged entirely to my mother. Beatrice had gambled away everything my late father had left her. Preston had quietly paid off her debts to keep her out of prison. That was the invisible leash. Preston bought my mother loyalty, and in exchange she sold her own daughter out to protect his golden goose. She did not just protect Marcus because she valued his status. She protected him because Preston owned her very freedom. My desk phone rang with a heavily encrypted signal. I answered and heard a woman's voice trembling on the other end. It was Marcus, lead corporate accountant. She was crying and breathing heavily into the receiver. She told me she was hiding in a parking garage in Midtown. She said men in dark sedans had been following her since Marcus sent that panicked text to wipe the servers. She begged for federal protection. I dispatched a tactical extraction team immediately. Before I could even leave the base to meet the extraction team, my personal cell phone buzzed. It was my sister Chloe. She demanded we meet at an upscale coffee shop in the wealthy district of Buckhead. She said she wanted to handle this quietly like family. I knew it was a trap, but I also knew it was an opportunity to gather more intelligence. I changed into civilian clothes, making sure my concealed carry weapon was secured at my hip. I walked into the cafe and found Chloe sitting at a corner table. She was sipping a matcha latte and wearing a silk blouse that cost more than most people earned in a month. Around her neck rested a massive, brilliant cut diamond necklace that caught the ambient light and threw rainbows across the wall. She slid a cashier check across the marble table toward me. It was made out for $100,000. Take it, Chloe said, stirring her drink without looking at me. Take the money, sign the divorce papers, and request a transfer to a base in another state. Preston is being generous, Valerie. He says you are just confused and emotional. We do not want to see you destroy your military career over a pathetic vendetta. I looked at the check. Then I looked at my sister. The entitlement radiating from her was suffocating. She truly believed her proximity to white wealth made her untouchable. I slowly pushed the check back across the table. I told Chloe I did not want Preston dirty money. I leaned forward and kept my eyes fixed on the massive diamond resting against her collarbone. I asked her where Preston had bought it. She smiled proudly, running her manicured fingers over the stones. She bragged that it was a custom piece imported from a private dealer in Geneva. She said it was a gift to celebrate their upcoming merger. I leaned back in my chair. I let out a soft, humorless laugh. I told Chloe she should really ask her husband more questions about his business associates. I recognized the specific cut and setting of those diamonds. They matched a very distinct catalog of jewels tied to an international money laundering syndicate my division had been tracking for 2 years. Preston was not just stealing federal veteran grants. He was using Marcus real estate developments to wash cartel money through high-end assets. Chloe's hand froze on her coffee cup. The confident glow vanished from her eyes, replaced by a flicker of genuine terror. She tried to stammer out a defense, but the words died in her throat. I stood up from the table and smoothed out my jacket. I told Chloe she should keep the necklace and take very good care of it. I smiled warmly and told her she was going to need to trade those diamonds for commissary money when she and her husband end up in federal prison. I walked out of the cafe without waiting for her response. My phone buzzed in my pocket as I stepped onto the sun-baked pavement. It was my tactical team commander. They had successfully extracted Marcus' accountant. She had a flash drive containing the offshore routing numbers, the ultimate proof of the entire criminal empire. The dominoes were perfectly lined up. Now it was time to push them all over. The sun was just beginning to burn through the thick Atlanta humidity when I pulled into our neighborhood. The sprawling Buckhead estate Marcus and I shared was supposed to be a monument to our success. It was a massive brick mansion with pristine landscaping, a wrought iron gate, and a sweeping driveway. It was the physical embodiment of the elite image Marcus was so obsessed with portraying to the world. I parked my military-issued vehicle on the street and walked up the long driveway. The gravel crunched beneath my boots. I was exhausted from the events at the precinct, but my mind was operating with razor-sharp precision. I knew exactly what kind of man I was dealing with, and I knew what his next move would be. I reached the grand front porch and punched my 6-digit code into the smart lock. The digital keypad beeped a harsh, angry red. Access denied. I tried again. Another red light. A loud, heavy click echoed from the other side of the solid oak doors. The deadbolt slid back and the door swung open. Marcus stood in the entryway. He had changed out of his blood-stained shirt and was now wearing a casual cashmere sweater. He looked perfectly relaxed and completely unapologetic. Standing directly behind him was a man I recognized instantly. He was a high-priced, aggressive divorce attorney known for destroying spouses in high-net-worth separations. And hovering just over the attorney's shoulder looking out at me with a cold, unforgiving stare was my own mother. Marcus smiled, his eyes completely devoid of warmth. "You are locked out, Valerie," he said smoothly. His voice echoed slightly in the grand foyer. "I changed the security codes the minute I left the precinct. Your access to all of our joint bank accounts has also been permanently suspended." The attorney stepped forward and shoved a thick manila folder into my chest. I instinctively caught it. He spoke with a practiced, arrogant drawl. He informed me that I was being served with an emergency petition for divorce. He said Marcus was filing for sole control of all corporate and personal assets. The attorney went on to explain that they had already filed a motion for a temporary restraining order against me. They were claiming that my military service had left me with severe emotional instability and paranoid delusions. They were painting me as an unhinged, traumatized veteran who posed a physical threat to her successful civilian husband. I opened the folder. The legal language was sharp, venomous, and entirely fabricated. It detailed completely made-up instances of me acting erratically. It even requested that my military commanders be formally notified of my declining mental health. They were not just trying to take my home and my money, they were actively trying to strip me of my military rank and destroy my career. They wanted me entirely destitute and discredited so that no one would ever believe a single word I said about their fraudulent federal grants. My mother stepped forward, pushing past the attorney. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest. The thick bandage on her forehead was stark white against her dark skin. It was a brutal, undeniable reminder of the violence she was actively helping to cover up. "You brought this on yourself, Valerie," she said, her tone dripping with absolute contempt. "A good woman stands by her husband. A smart woman knows when to keep her mouth shut and protect the family business. You chose to act like a lunatic at the police station, so now you get to leave with exactly what you brought into this marriage. Nothing." I looked at the woman who had given birth to me. She was willing to throw her own daughter to the wolves to protect a man who had beaten her with a baseball bat just hours ago. She was doing it all because Preston and Marcus promised her endless access to a country club lifestyle and debt forgiveness. Marcus leaned against the door frame, looking incredibly pleased with himself. He was basking in the glow of his perceived victory. "Your personal credit cards are frozen too," he added, pouring salt into the wound. "I suggest you start walking to a bus stop. Or maybe you can beg one of your army buddies for a cash loan. You have 30 days to respond to the legal filing, but I would save yourself the financial embarrassment and just sign it now. You are outgunned, Valerie. You have no money, you have no house, and very soon you will have no career." I did not shout. I did not throw the folder back at his smug face. I did not shed a single tear. I stood on the pristine porch of the mansion I had helped pay for, and I let a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I calmly closed the manila folder and tucked it neatly under my arm. I looked Marcus dead in the eye. I told him he was incredibly predictable. I told him that locking out a spouse and freezing accounts was page 1 of the narcissistic abuser playbook. Then I reached deep into the pocket of my tactical jacket. Marcus tensed slightly, perhaps expecting me to pull out my service weapon. Instead, I pulled out a heavy set of keys attached to a thick black lanyard. I turned around and pointed the key fob at the massive black SUV parked on the street behind me. It was not a standard civilian vehicle. It was a heavily modified, armored tactical vehicle issued directly by the Department of Defense. I pressed a button on the fob. The heavy reinforced trunk of the SUV slowly hummed open, revealing the cargo space. I turned back to Marcus, his sleazy attorney, and my mother. I told Marcus he was very quick to freeze my personal checking accounts, but I told him he was significantly slower at managing his own corporate digital footprint. I pointed down the driveway toward the open trunk of the SUV. Sitting inside, taking up the entire back end of the vehicle, was a mobile military-grade server rack. Dozens of green and blue encrypted lights blinked steadily against the dark interior of the truck. I took a step closer to the door, ensuring my voice was crystal clear. "You sent a text message to your lead accountant exactly 30 seconds after I walked out of the police precinct," I said. You told her to wipe the servers immediately because I knew about the stolen veteran funds. Marcus' smug expression instantly shattered. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking hollow and utterly terrified. I tapped the side of the manila folder. The thing about military cyber units, Marcus, is that we do not need physical access to your downtown office to duplicate your hard drives. While you were busy driving home to change the code to the front door, my team was remotely downloading every offshore routing number, every hidden ledger, and every fake invoice you and Preston ever created. Your accountant did not wipe the servers fast enough. I have everything. The high-priced attorney suddenly looked incredibly nervous. He shifted his weight uncomfortably and glanced back and forth between me and Marcus, realizing he had just attached his name to a massive federal crime. My mother's jaw dropped in silent horror as the reality of the situation finally registered. I smiled warmly at the three of them. I told Marcus I would not be walking to a bus stop today, but I highly recommended he start looking for a good bail bondsman. I turned my back on the beautiful house and walked down the driveway toward my waiting vehicle. I had every single piece of evidence I needed to burn their fraudulent empire to the ground, and the match was already lit. I left my former home in the rearview mirror and drove my tactical vehicle straight through the thick morning heat to the Criminal Investigation Division headquarters at Fort McPherson. The air conditioning inside the secure underground bunker was a sharp contrast to the suffocating Atlanta humidity. My cyber unit had already transformed our primary briefing area into a full-scale war room. The walls were covered in digital displays, projecting the raw data we had just pulled from the mobile server rack. I swiped my military keycard and walked into the quiet, steady hum of government processors. My lead forensic specialist handed me a secured tablet the moment I crossed the threshold. We had bypassed their commercial encryption before Marcus and his high-priced attorney even had time to draft their fake restraining order. Now it was time to follow the money and map out the exact anatomy of their betrayal. I spent the next 6 hours standing in front of those glowing screens, methodically dissecting the financial web they had spent years building. It was a masterpiece of corporate deceit dressed up beautifully as progressive social mobility. Preston was the true architect of the entire operation. As a wealthy white venture capitalist, he did not qualify for the highly lucrative federal minority business grants or the massive Department of Defense veteran housing subsidies that were pouring into the city. He needed a frontman. He needed Marcus. Marcus was young, charismatic, and played the part of the highly successful Black entrepreneur flawlessly. He was the golden boy of Atlanta high society, attending charity galas and giving speeches on community development. But the raw data scrolling across my monitors told the real story. Marcus owned absolutely nothing. His real estate firm was a hollow shell company designed specifically to catch federal funds. Every time the government awarded a multi-million-dollar contract to Marcus for veteran housing developments, the funds sat in his corporate accounts for less than 24 hours. I watched the transaction logs prove exactly how Preston operated. He would immediately funnel the federal money out of Marcus accounts through a labyrinth of phantom LLCs, fake construction vendors, and offshore holdings in the Cayman Islands. Marcus got the custom-tailored suits, the luxury cars, and the magazine covers, praising his contribution to Black excellence. Preston got the actual millions. My husband was nothing more than a highly paid puppet wearing a diverse face to steal from taxpayers and vulnerable veterans. Preston was using the powerful narrative of minority empowerment to completely mask his own systematic theft. But understanding the mechanics of the corporate fraud was only half the puzzle. I needed to know why my own mother was so incredibly willing to sacrifice me to protect them. I needed to understand why Beatrice, a woman who had always preached about the sacred bond of family, had stood on my front porch and watched me get locked out of my own home without a single shred of remorse. I directed my cyber team to pull my mother's personal financial records dating back a full decade. I stood perfectly still, watching the screens as her banking history populated line by line. The numbers painted a sickening, devastating picture of who my mother truly was. Years before Chloe even met Preston, my mother had been bleeding money at an astonishing rate. I stared at massive wire transfers sent to offshore sports betting accounts and underground casinos. She had quietly and systematically gambled away everything my late father had worked his entire life to leave us. She was hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt to very dangerous people. She was facing total financial ruin and potential criminal charges for writing bad checks. Then, exactly 5 years ago, the crippling debts simply vanished overnight. A single massive lump sum payment wiped her slate completely clean. The origin of that payment traced directly back to one of Preston's private holding companies. I sat down in the glow of the monitors, processing the absolute depth of the betrayal. My mother had not just chosen Marcus and Chloe because they were financially successful. She chose them because Preston literally owned her freedom. He had bought her loyalty and kept the threat of prison hanging over her head. She was a permanent hostage to her own vices. That was why she had been so desperate to cover up the domestic violence at the police station hours earlier. She was terrified that if Marcus went down for assault, the federal scrutiny would unravel the corporate fraud and Preston would cut her off, letting the bookies collect what she owed. She sold her own daughter's safety for a clean balance sheet and an invite to the country club. It was a pathetic, deeply transactional existence. I felt a cold, absolute clarity wash over me. The anger that had been burning in my chest all morning solidified into something much more dangerous. I no longer saw her as my mother. I saw her as an active accomplice in a federal conspiracy. She had made her choice, and now she would have to face the full weight of the consequences. I authorized my team to begin drafting the preliminary federal arrest warrants. We had concrete evidence of wire fraud, money laundering, and the gross misappropriation of federal funds. We were building an airtight cage that neither Preston wealth nor Marcus' social charm could ever break out of. I was just reviewing the final asset seizure documents, ensuring that every single one of their accounts would be frozen before sunset, when my secure desk phone began to ring. It was a direct encrypted line, meaning the call had been routed through our emergency intake system. I picked up the heavy black receiver. On the other end, I heard a woman breathing heavily, her voice trembling with raw, unfiltered panic. It was Sarah, the lead corporate accountant for Marcus' real estate firm. She was crying so hard she could barely form a coherent sentence. She told me she had fled the downtown corporate office immediately after Marcus sent that frantic text message ordering her to wipe the servers. She said she knew exactly what Marcus and Preston were doing, and she knew they were going to use her as the ultimate scapegoat when the federal auditors finally arrived. She had taken a physical backup drive containing the master ledgers before she ran. Now she was hiding behind a concrete pillar in a subterranean parking garage in Midtown. She begged me for federal protection. Her voice dropped to a terrified whisper as she described the scene. She said 2 men in unmarked dark sedans had been slowly circling the lower levels of the garage for the past 20 minutes, and she knew they were actively looking for her. My phone rang at 2 in the morning. My mother was on the other end, choking on her own blood. She whispered that my husband just beat her with a baseball bat. 20 minutes later, I walked into the Atlanta police precinct expecting to see the man I married locked behind bars. Instead, he was drinking a premium latte at the front desk, laughing with a patrol officer. When the desk sergeant saw me, his face drained of all color. He held up his hands and begged me to let him explain. I did not want an explanation. I wanted jurisdiction. The drive from the military base to the downtown precinct took exactly 19 minutes. I did not turn on the radio. I did not cry. My military training had already kicked in, shutting down the panic and replacing it with cold, absolute precision. I am a major in the United States Army Criminal Investigation Division. My daily life consists of dismantling international fraud rings and prosecuting high-level military offenders. I know what violent crime looks like. I know what a crime scene smells like. But nothing could have prepared me for the sight waiting for me inside that police station. The automatic doors slid open and the blast of sterile air conditioning hit my face. The precinct lobby was nearly empty at this hour, save for a few exhausted patrol officers doing paperwork. And there, sitting casually at the main processing desk, was my 34-year-old husband, Marcus. He was wearing his custom-tailored Tom Ford suit. He had one leg crossed over the other, revealing his expensive leather loafers. He was holding a steaming cup of coffee and chuckling at something the desk sergeant had just said. He was not in handcuffs. He was not in an interrogation room. He was holding court like he was at a private country club mixer. The only thing out of place on his entire immaculate body was the unmistakable spray of crimson blood on his crisp white shirt collar. It was my mother's blood. I walked across the scuffed linoleum floor. The heavy thud of my tactical boots echoed through the quiet lobby. The desk sergeant, a heavy-set man with tired eyes, looked up at me. He offered a sympathetic, patronizing smile that made my stomach churn. Valerie Baby Marcus said, his voice smooth and entirely unbothered. He stood up and adjusted his suit jacket. You really did not need to come all the way down here. It was just a little misunderstanding. Your mother got confused again. She tripped on the stairs at the house. You know how her memory has been lately. I ignored him completely. I kept my eyes fixed entirely on the desk sergeant. I asked him why the man who had just brutally assaulted a 60-year-old woman was currently enjoying a coffee break in the lobby instead of being processed for aggravated assault. The sergeant sighed and leaned forward on his desk. He used a tone usually reserved for calming down irrational civilians. Now, Mrs. Jenkins, he began. Your husband is a highly respected real estate developer in this city. He brings a lot of money and a lot of jobs into Atlanta. We sent a squad car to your mother's house, and there are no clear signs of a struggle. It seems the elderly woman simply had a terrible fall. We cannot just arrest a prominent businessman based on the confused ramblings of a senior citizen who bumped her head. Why do you not take your husband home and let everyone get some sleep? We will write this up as a medical assist and close the file. Marcus smirked. He knew exactly what he was doing. He had used his wealth and his status as a beacon of black excellence in the community to charm the local police into looking the other way. He thought he was untouchable. He thought I was just going to be another hysterical wife who would scream and cry and eventually be escorted out for causing a disturbance. He wanted me to act out. He wanted me to look unstable so he could justify whatever lies he was spinning. I did not yell. I did not shed a single tear. I stood perfectly still. I reached into the inside pocket of my tactical jacket. I pulled out my solid brass identification shield. I slammed it down onto the metal desk with a force that made the sergeant coffee cup rattle against the wood. Major Valerie Jenkins, I said, my voice cutting through the room with absolute authority. United States Army Criminal Investigation Division. You say there are no clear signs of a struggle, Sergeant. I suggest you look closer. There is literal blood spatter on his collar. But more importantly, the vehicle he used to drive away from the scene is the black armored SUV currently parked right outside your front window. That is a federal military vehicle assigned strictly to my unit. He took the keys from my safe and used federal property to flee the scene of a violent felony. That means this case just bypassed your entire local jurisdiction. The silence in the room was deafening. The sergeant stared at the gleaming gold badge on his desk. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly. The patronizing smile vanished from his face, replaced by sheer professional terror. He realized he had just been caught covering up a violent crime in front of a high-ranking federal officer. Marcus dropped his coffee cup into the trash can. His smug demeanor shattered instantly. Are you out of your mind? He hissed, stepping toward me. You are going to use the military to lock up your own husband over a scratch. You are going to ruin my entire reputation over this. You know I am closing a massive merger next week. I did not back down. I looked him dead in the eye and told him his reputation was the least of his problems. I told him he was going to face federal charges for the unauthorized use of a military vehicle, and I was going to personally oversee the forensic analysis of his blood-stained shirt. The desk sergeant swallowed hard. He reached nervously for his radio, his hands shaking slightly. He murmured that he needed to call his captain and that they needed to formally detain Marcus immediately. He reached for the handcuffs clipped to his belt. Marcus took a step back, his eyes darting toward the exit like a trapped animal. I had him exactly where I wanted him. The trap had snapped shut. But before the sergeant could unclip his handcuffs, the heavy double doors of the precinct burst open. "Stop right there," a voice commanded. I turned around and felt all the air leave my lungs. It was my mother, Beatrice. She was leaning heavily on a wooden cane. A thick white bandage was wrapped securely around her forehead. Her left eye was swollen completely shut, and dark purple bruises were already blooming along her jawline. She looked frail and battered, but she was not looking at Marcus with fear. She was looking at me with pure, unadulterated fury. Beside her stood my older sister Chloe. Chloe looked immaculate in a designer trench coat holding a luxury handbag, as if she were walking a runway rather than entering a police station at 2 in the morning. And hovering right behind them was Chloe's white husband, Preston. Preston was a wealthy, arrogant venture capitalist who loved to play the ultimate savior for our family. He had his hand resting protectively on my mother's shoulder, but his eyes were locked on me with a cold, calculating glare. "Mom, what are you doing here?" I asked, taking a step toward her. "I already called the federal medics to meet you at the house. You need to be at the hospital. I do not need medics, Valerie." My mother snapped, her voice trembling but defensive. "Marcus is right. I fell. I tripped on the expensive rug near the staircase. I was disoriented and confused when I called you. Withdraw your complaint immediately." I stared at her, trying to process the absolute betrayal unfolding in front of my eyes. "Mom, I heard you on the phone. I heard the fear in your voice. I can see the shape of the bruising on your face right now. You do not get a perfectly cylindrical contusion from a flat staircase. You were struck with a weapon." My mother slammed her cane against the floor. "I said I fell," she yelled, her voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Stop trying to destroy your husband. Stop trying to tear this family apart. Pick up your badge, Valerie, and tell this officer you made a mistake." The entire police station seemed to hold its breath. The desk sergeant slowly pulled his hand away from his handcuffs, looking back and forth between me and my bleeding mother. Marcus let out a long breath, and a slow, victorious smile crept back onto his face. He adjusted his expensive watch and looked at me with deep, mocking pity. I stood frozen in the center of the room. My own mother had driven across the city with a fractured skull just to protect the man who had nearly killed her. She was willing to look me in the eye and lie to a federal officer just to preserve the wealthy, elite image Marcus provided to our family. The depth of her manipulation was staggering. She was choosing a violent fraud over her own flesh and blood. The battle lines were drawn right there on the scuffed linoleum floor, and I knew in that exact moment that this was no longer just about a domestic dispute. This was a war. I drove straight from the affluent streets of Buckhead to the secure federal safe house where my tactical team had relocated Marcus' lead accountant. The underground facility felt entirely disconnected from the sweltering Atlanta heat above. Sarah sat at a metal interrogation table, gripping a styrofoam cup of water. Her hands were shaking violently, and her eyes were darting around the windowless room. She knew exactly what kind of men she was running from. She slid a sleek silver flash drive across the table toward me. She told me it contained 7 years of unrestricted financial ledgers. Every shadow account, every phantom vendor, and every illicit wire transfer Preston and Marcus ever authorized was neatly categorized inside that tiny piece of metal. I plugged the drive into my secured terminal and watched the true scope of their empire unfold across the high-resolution monitors. The corporate fraud was massive, but I am a military investigator. I do not just look at the corporate numbers. I look at the personal expenditures. People who steal federal millions always leave a trail of arrogant purchases. I started pulling the credit card statements linked to Marcus' private shell companies. I expected to see the usual executive waste: expensive dinners, luxury car leases, and bespoke suits. Instead, I found a trail of highly specific romantic purchases. There were weekend bookings at a secluded ski resort in Aspen. There was a $50,000 wire transfer to a boutique jeweler in Paris. There were private jet charters to the Caribbean, scattered across the past 2 years. I pulled the passenger manifests for those flights, expecting to see a string of random women. But the name printed next to my husband on every single flight log made my blood run ice cold. It was Amanda, Preston lead executive assistant. Amanda was a 26-year-old white woman who attended every family dinner and corporate gala alongside Preston. She was the one who always complimented my mother on her outfits and smiled sweetly at my sister Chloe. She had stood in my living room sipping champagne and acting like a loyal employee. Now I was staring at undeniable proof that she had been sleeping with my husband for over 2 years right under my nose. But the affair was not just a cliché betrayal. As my cyber team dug deeper into Amanda deleted email archives, I realized it was a highly calculated corporate strategy. Preston knew exactly what was going on between his assistant and his business partner. In fact, the emails proved Preston actually orchestrated it. He actively encouraged Amanda to keep Marcus completely distracted and thoroughly compromised. While Marcus was busy taking secret vacations with the assistant and thinking he was the king of Atlanta, Preston was quietly restructuring the corporate bylaws in the background. The legal documents hidden deep within the flash drive were a masterpiece of legal sabotage. Over the last 18 months, Preston had slowly and meticulously transferred every single ounce of criminal liability directly onto Marcus. Preston's name had been completely scrubbed from the high-risk federal grants. The shell companies used to launder the Department of Defense funds were now legally registered solely under Marcus' signature. If the government ever initiated an audit, Marcus would take the sole blame. Preston was planning to take the millions they stole, wire them to an untouchable account in Switzerland, and walk away completely clean. My husband would be left holding the bag, spending the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary. Marcus was nothing but a disposable pawn to Preston. He was a convenient black face carefully selected to take the fall for massive white-collar crime, while Preston maintained his pristine image as a generous venture capitalist. My tactical team waited in the briefing room for my orders. They expected me to freeze the accounts immediately and send the arrest warrants to a federal judge. But I raised my hand and told them to stand down. If I arrested them now, Preston's high-priced legal team might find a loophole. They would circle the wagons and present a unified front. I needed them to turn on each other first. I needed their alliance to completely fracture from the inside out. There is nothing more dangerous than thieves who suddenly realize they are being robbed by their own partners. I sat down at my terminal and began to weaponize the truth. I isolated the specific legal documents proving Preston had shifted all the criminal liability onto Marcus. I bundled those documents with the flight manifests, the jewelry receipts, and high-resolution security photos of Marcus and Amanda kissing in the lobby of the Aspen Resort. I created a digital package of pure, absolute destruction. I scrubbed the file of all federal tracking markers and routed it through an untraceable proxy server in Eastern Europe. I wanted Marcus to think a whistleblower or a rival developer was blackmailing him. I sent the anonymous encrypted package directly to Marcus' personal cell phone. I leaned back in my leather chair and pulled up the live surveillance feed of Marcus' downtown office building. I watched the screen with cold, calculated patience. 10 minutes later, the feed showed Marcus bursting out of his corner office suite. His face was pale and contorted with absolute rage. He knocked a heavy chair over as he sprinted past the reception desk toward the executive elevator. He was clutching his cell phone so tightly his knuckles were white. He was not heading home. He was heading straight for Preston. The wolves were finally starting to eat each other, and I had the best seat in the house. I drove back to the base with the silver flash drive secured in my tactical vest. Sarah was safe in federal protective custody, and the ultimate proof of Preston and Marcus' criminal empire was literally resting over my heart. I felt a surge of pure victory. But I severely underestimated the sheer speed and reach of elite white institutional power in Atlanta. By the time I swiped my clearance card at the Criminal Investigation Division headquarters, the atmosphere had completely changed. The monitors in my cyber war room were powered down. The room was dead silent. Standing in the center of the room were 2 agents from the Department of Defense Office of Inspector General. They were flanked by my commanding officer, General Thomas. The lead agent stepped forward and immediately demanded my sidearm and my brass shield. He informed me that I was being placed on indefinite administrative leave, pending a formal congressional inquiry. He read the charges aloud from a digital tablet. Abuse of military authority, harassment of private citizens, unauthorized surveillance, theft of classified government property. I looked at General Thomas, but his face was an unreadable mask of strict military discipline. The federal agent continued explaining the situation. A very prominent United States senator from Georgia had personally contacted the Pentagon that morning. The senator claimed I was a rogue officer using federal resources to execute a personal vendetta against my husband and his highly respected venture capitalist partner. Preston had not just called a lawyer, he had called Washington. He leveraged his massive political donations to paint me exactly how he threatened to. An unstable, angry black woman trying to ruin a progressive corporate merger out of sheer jealousy. He wanted me stripped of my badge and my access so I could not process the flash drive I had just acquired. He thought removing my official authority would leave me defenseless. I did not argue. Arguing with federal investigators only gives them the erratic reaction they are actively looking for. I calmly unholstered my weapon and placed it on the cold steel table. I set my gold badge right next to it. I was officially ordered to pack my personal belongings and vacate the premises within 15 minutes. I was explicitly forbidden from accessing any military databases, contacting any witnesses, or continuing any form of investigation. I grabbed a small cardboard box and began emptying my desk. My cyber team stood in the corners of the room watching in stunned silence. They knew I had the evidence to put Preston and Marcus away for decades, but they also knew they could not defy a direct order from the Inspector General. As I walked down the sterile concrete hallway carrying my belongings, my personal cell phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a text message from my mother, Beatrice. It read, "I heard the military finally figured out how completely unstable you are. You should have just signed the divorce papers and walked away quietly. Now you have absolutely nothing." A second message arrived immediately after. It was from Chloe. "Preston says his offer still stands. You can keep the $100,000 if you leave the state today. Do not embarrass this family any further." They thought they had won. They truly believed that stripping me of my uniform meant they had stripped me of my power. They thought I was just a discarded wife and a disgraced soldier with nowhere left to turn. They were celebrating my downfall while actively sitting on a mountain of stolen federal money. I pushed through the heavy exit doors and walked out into the sweltering afternoon heat. I reached my armored SUV and opened the driver's side door, placing my cardboard box on the passenger seat. Suddenly, a tall shadow fell over my vehicle. It was General Thomas. He was not accompanied by the federal investigators. He looked carefully around the empty parking lot, ensuring we were completely unobserved. He did not say a word at first. He just reached into the inside pocket of his dress uniform jacket and pulled out a thick, unmarked manila envelope. He reached past me and slid it directly under the cardboard box on my passenger seat. I looked at the hidden envelope and then up at my commanding officer. A slow, deliberate smile spread across his weathered face. He gave me a subtle, knowing wink. "The formal investigation is tying my official hands, Valerie," he said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper. "But a suspended officer acting entirely on her own accord operates completely outside of Pentagon oversight. The formal mission is dead. The Black Op officially begins. Go hunting, Major." I sat in the driver's seat of my armored SUV, staring at the unmarked manila envelope General Thomas had just slipped onto my passenger seat. I tore open the heavy paper flap. Inside was a classified digital token, a burn phone, and a single sheet of paper bearing the highest level of military intelligence clearance. It was an off-the-books authorization. I was no longer bound by the bureaucratic red tape of formal investigations. I was a ghost, and I had absolute authorization to dismantle their empire by any means necessary. But to catch predators who think they are apex hunters, you have to play the wounded prey. The very next morning, Marcus and his high-priced attorney expedited the emergency divorce hearing at the Fulton County Courthouse. They used Preston political connections to bypass the usual waiting periods. They wanted me legally severed from Marcus' assets before I could launch any civilian legal counterattacks. They wanted to financially execute me in broad daylight. I walked into the polished mahogany conference room on the fourth floor of the courthouse. The air conditioning was freezing, but the atmosphere in the room was even colder. Marcus sat at the center of the massive conference table wearing a sharp navy blue suit. He looked like he had just won the lottery. Preston stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, casually adjusting his cashmere quarter zip. He was not a party to the divorce, but he was there to oversee his investment and to relish in my total defeat. My mother, Beatrice, and my sister, Chloe, were sitting in the gallery chairs directly behind Marcus. They were whispering to each other and shooting me looks of absolute disgust. They had shown up just to watch me lose everything. Marcus' attorney slid a thick stack of legal documents across the polished wood table. "These are the final dissolution agreements," Valerie, the attorney, said, his voice dripping with condescension. "My client is being incredibly generous by not pursuing a civil suit against you for the emotional distress you caused at the police precinct. However, given your erratic behavior and your recent suspension from the military, he is claiming sole ownership of all corporate entities, investment portfolios, and real estate holdings. You will sign away any and all marital rights to the Vanguard venture funds and the offshore holding accounts. In exchange, you walk away with the clothes on your back and avoiding a protracted legal battle you cannot possibly afford." I looked down at the papers. I knew exactly what those specific funds held. They held the stolen $45 million from the Department of Defense. They held the cartel money Preston was washing through Marcus' shell companies. I took a slow, shaky breath. I let my shoulders slump forward. I forced my hands to tremble visibly as I reached out to touch the edges of the legal documents. I looked up at Marcus and widened my eyes, letting a thin sheen of tears pool in my vision. "Marcus, please," I said, letting my voice crack perfectly. "I have nothing left. The military took my badge. My accounts are frozen. Can you not at least leave me the equity from the house? I helped pay the mortgage for 3 years." Marcus leaned back in his leather chair and laughed. It was a cold, cruel sound that echoed off the mahogany walls. "You do not get to dictate terms anymore, Valerie," he sneered. "You tried to play the big, tough federal agent and you failed. You are a disgraced suspended soldier with a history of mental instability. Sign the papers and give up your claim to the corporate funds, or I will make sure my legal team drags you through civil court until you are bankrupt and sleeping on the streets of Atlanta." My mother chimed in from the back of the room. "Just sign it, Valerie," she snapped. "Stop embarrassing us. You tried to ruin your husband and it blew up in your face. Take your punishment like a grown woman." Preston walked over from the window and placed his hands on the back of Marcus' chair. He looked down at me with an expression of pure white savior arrogance. "Valerie, you really should listen to your family," Preston said smoothly. "You tried to step into a financial arena you simply do not understand. Marcus has built a legitimate corporate empire. He is the sole owner and operator of these funds. You have no right to his hard-earned capital. Sign the relinquishment and walk away." I kept my head bowed. I let a single tear spill over my eyelashes and roll down my cheek. I reached for the heavy silver pen resting on the table. My hand shook violently as I positioned the pen over the signature line. I hesitated, biting my lower lip as if I was struggling with the ultimate defeat. "Sign the damn paper," Marcus growled, losing his patience. I pressed the pen to the paper. I signed my name on the first page. I flipped to the second page and signed again. I initialed every single clause that explicitly stated I was forfeiting any legal marital claim to the Vanguard venture funds, the offshore accounts, and the federal grant holding companies. I signed a total of 14 times, legally binding myself to 0% ownership of Marcus' corporate empire. I slid the stack of documents back across the table. The attorney snatched them up immediately, checking every signature line with a triumphant grin. He nodded at Marcus. "We are done here," the attorney said, closing his briefcase. "You are officially severed from all of my client financial holdings." Marcus stood up and buttoned his suit jacket. He looked down at me like I was dirt on the bottom of his expensive Italian loafers. "Next time you try to take down a real man, make sure you actually have the power to do it," he whispered. Chloe and my mother stood up from their chairs, smiling and whispering congratulations to Marcus. Preston clapped my ex-husband on the shoulder, already steering him toward the door to celebrate their absolute victory. They made it exactly 3 steps toward the exit before I stood up. My posture shifted instantly. The slump in my shoulders vanished. The trembling in my hands stopped dead. I wiped the fake tear from my cheek and stood at rigid military attention. The sudden aggressive change in my demeanor made Preston stop in his tracks. He turned around looking at me with a sudden flicker of confusion. I smiled. It was not a sad, defeated smile. It was the sharp, terrifying smile of a predator that had just locked the cage from the outside. "I want to thank you, Marcus," I said, my voice completely devoid of the weakness I had just manufactured. It echoed clearly through the quiet room. Marcus frowned, gripping the door handle. "Thank me for what he spat." "For being so incredibly arrogant and legally stupid," I replied. I picked up my copy of the signed divorce decree. "You see, I have been trying to figure out how to completely isolate myself from the criminal liability of your corporate fraud. As your wife, the federal government could have technically implicated me in your money laundering operation through our marital assets." The room went dead silent. The attorney stopped packing his briefcase. "But you just fixed that problem for me." I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward them. "You just forced me to sign a binding court-certified document. You explicitly demanded that I waive all rights to those specific investment portfolios. You brought your lawyer here to legally ensure that I have absolutely zero connection to the Vanguard venture funds." Preston's face suddenly drained of color. He realized exactly what I was saying before Marcus did. "By forcing me to sign that relinquishment," I said, locking eyes with Marcus, "you just signed a legally binding confession that you are the sole independent owner and operator of those accounts. You just claimed 100% of the criminal liability for the stolen $45 million in federal defense funds." Marcus' jaw dropped. He looked frantically at his attorney, but the lawyer was already backing away, looking completely terrified. I walked past my stunned mother and my trembling sister. I stopped right in front of Marcus and Preston. "You boys just officially claimed sole ownership of a massive federal crime," I whispered. "Good luck explaining the source of that money to the Internal Revenue Service." I did not wait to see the panic truly set into Preston's eyes. I turned and walked out of the mahogany conference room, leaving the heavy double doors wide open behind me. The echo of my boots on the marble floor was the only sound in the hallway. I had handed them the rope, and their own greed had tied the noose. But setting the trap was only the beginning. Now I had to let them walk onto the public stage they loved so much. 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks of absolute silence from my end. In the world of high finance and corporate fraud, silence is often mistaken for surrender. Preston and Marcus took my quiet retreat as total victory. They truly believed I had given up. They thought the signed divorce papers and my military suspension had completely neutralized me. Their arrogance blinded them to the invisible federal net closing in around their entire operation. To celebrate their monumental merger and to officially wash the stolen federal millions into the legitimate market, they orchestrated the social event of the season. They called it the Vanguard of the Future Gala. It was hosted in the Grand Ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton in downtown Atlanta. The invitations were printed on heavy gold embossed cardstock and mailed to every major politician, real estate mogul, and social elite in the city. The stated purpose of the gala was to announce a groundbreaking $50 million community investment initiative. They were going to stand on a stage in front of hundreds of people and proudly declare how much they were doing to uplift Black neighborhoods. In reality, that $50 million consisted of the $45 million they stole from the Department of Defense veteran housing grants, mixed perfectly with $5 million in untraceable cartel cash. It was the final spin cycle in Preston's massive money laundering machine. Once those funds were publicly pledged to the new community initiative, the money would be completely integrated into the legitimate banking system. It was a bold, brilliant, and utterly sickening plan. Marcus was riding an unprecedented high. I watched local news segments where he gave interviews about his philanthropic vision. He smiled for the cameras, wearing bespoke suits and talking about how his real estate developments were going to change the landscape of Atlanta. He played the role of the generous visionary flawlessly, completely forgetting that he had just signed a legal document claiming sole liability for the very funds he was bragging about. Preston stayed out of the camera frame, perfectly content to let his black business partner take all the public credit and unknowingly all the federal risk. My mother Beatrice leaned into the illusion with everything she had. She was no longer just the mother-in-law. She was positioning herself as the matriarch of an Atlanta dynasty. She spent tens of thousands of dollars on a custom couture gown for the event using the very credit cards Preston had paid off for her. Chloe was right there beside her, boasting about the exclusive designer jewelry she had flown in just for the occasion. They were so intoxicated by their proximity to wealth that they decided to permanently and publicly sever their ties with me. 2 days before the gala, my cyber team intercepted a public post my mother published on her social media pages. It was a long, carefully crafted statement designed to garner sympathy and protect the family image. She wrote about the pain of watching a child lose their way. She claimed that my military service had left me with severe, unmanageable mental health issues. She told her thousands of followers that I had become violently jealous of Marcus' success and that I had tried to sabotage his philanthropic efforts out of pure spite. She ended the post by stating that for the safety and peace of the family, she was forced to make the agonizing decision to cut me out of her life. She called me a tragic disgrace to the family name. My team asked if I wanted the post taken down. I told them to leave it up. I wanted her public betrayal permanently archived. I wanted every single person who read that post to remember her exact words when the truth finally broke. I wanted the world to see exactly how quickly she sold her own daughter to protect a man who beat her with a baseball bat. The afternoon of the gala arrived. The Atlanta air was thick and heavy with an impending summer thunderstorm. I was standing in the kitchen of my temporary federal safe house, holding a pair of sharp steel pruning shears. I was carefully trimming the stems of a dozen white roses I had bought for myself that morning. There is something deeply therapeutic about cutting away dead weight. You make a clean, sharp, angled cut, and you discard the pieces that are dragging the healthy blossom down. I watched the severed green stems fall onto the granite countertop. I felt absolutely no anxiety. The adrenaline that had fueled me during the initial confrontation at the police precinct had settled into a cold mechanical focus. I had spent the last 3 weeks working entirely off the books, utilizing the covert authorization General Thomas had slipped into my car. My cyber unit had successfully mirrored every single transaction Preston and Marcus initiated. We had embedded digital tracking tokens into the specific financial routing numbers they planned to use during the gala. We knew exactly which offshore accounts the money was sitting in, and we knew the exact millisecond they planned to transfer the funds to the public charity ledger. We were not just going to arrest them, we were going to let them initiate the transfer on stage, and then we were going to freeze the assets in midair. We were going to seize their entire empire in front of every prominent investor in the state of Georgia. We were going to turn their moment of ultimate triumph into a perfectly executed financial execution. My secure military phone began to vibrate on the kitchen counter. I set the pruning shears down and picked up the device. The caller identification showed a restricted government sequence. It was the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Atlanta Field Office. The FBI had officially joined my off-the-books operation, bringing their full tactical jurisdiction to support my military intelligence. I answered the phone. The director did not offer a greeting. He spoke with the crisp, efficient cadence of a man who was ready to execute a massive tactical strike. Major Jenkins, the director, said, his voice projecting clearly through the encrypted line. The tactical teams are fully briefed and in position. We have plainclothes agents securing all perimeter exits at the Ritz-Carlton. Cyber Command has active lock on their primary offshore routing servers. The net is completely set. Tonight we haul it in. I looked at the white roses resting in the glass vase. I told the director I was uploading the final asset seizure warrants to a secure portal right now. I told him I would meet his tactical lead at the service elevator of the hotel in exactly 2 hours. I ended the call and let the heavy silence of the safe house wash over me one last time. The waiting was over. It was time to show my family exactly what an angry black woman with federal authority could really do. 10 floors above the grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton Marcus and Preston were completely oblivious to the trap closing around them. They had reserved the presidential suite to serve as their private command center for the evening. The thick, soundproof walls insulated them from the booming jazz band and the chatter of the hundreds of wealthy guests gathered below. Preston was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the glittering Atlanta skyline. He was pouring a bottle of incredibly rare vintage champagne into 2 crystal flutes. Marcus was pacing the length of the plush suite, admiring his reflection in the gilded mirrors. He was wearing a custom-tailored velvet dinner jacket, looking every bit the billionaire philanthropist he was pretending to be. Down in the main ballroom, my mother and my sister were playing their parts perfectly. Through the encrypted security feed on my tablet, I watched Beatrice working the room. She was practically floating in her designer gown, accepting compliments and donations from local politicians and elite socialites. She was taking photos with the mayor, projecting the image of a proud, triumphant matriarch. Chloe was right beside her, strategically positioning herself so the massive ballroom chandeliers would catch the light of the stolen cartel diamonds resting against her collarbone. They were celebrating their final ascent into the absolute highest tier of Atlanta society. They thought they had successfully discarded me and secured their royal status forever. They had no idea they were dancing on the deck of a sinking ship. Back in the penthouse suite, Preston walked over to a massive mahogany desk. Sitting in the center of the desk was a single silver laptop. This was the beating heart of their entire criminal empire. The laptop was connected directly to a private encrypted satellite network designed to bypass standard commercial tracking. Preston typed in a sequence of complex passwords, bringing up the master ledger for the Vanguard venture funds. He called Marcus over to the desk, handing him a glass of champagne. Preston smiled, his arrogant white savior smile on full display. He told Marcus that this was the defining moment of their careers. He explained the final step of the process with absolute pride. The stolen $45 million from the Department of Defense was currently resting in a shadow account in the Cayman Islands, heavily mixed with $5 million of illicit cartel cash. Preston explained that the second he initiated the transfer, the money would leave the offshore sanctuary and immediately drop into the newly formed Vanguard of the Future Community Initiative ledger. Because the initiative was registered as a heavily protected domestic charity, the funds would be instantly legitimized. The money would be completely washed clean in the blink of an eye. The federal government would never be able to audit a minority community development fund without risking a massive political and public relations scandal. It was the ultimate protective shield built entirely on the weaponization of social progress. Marcus took a long, confident sip of his champagne. He laughed, looking down at the glowing screen. He told Preston that the best part of the entire plan was knowing I was sitting somewhere in a cheap apartment, completely broke and thoroughly defeated. Marcus bragged that he had forced me to sign away all my rights and that I had actually cried while doing it. He believed he had completely broken my spirit. He truly believed he had outsmarted a federal military investigator and stripped me of my power. What neither of them knew was that my cyber command unit was watching their every single move. We were not just looking through a hidden camera in the suite. We were inside the laptop itself. 3 weeks ago, when Marcus forced me to sign those divorce papers, I had planted a microscopic digital receiver in the leather binder holding the documents. When his high-priced attorney placed that binder next to his computer back at their corporate office, my team gained a permanent backdoor access point to their entire encrypted network. We had spent the last 21 days attaching invisible digital tracking tokens to every single cent in those offshore accounts. We did not freeze the accounts early because we needed Preston to manually authorize the transfer back onto American soil. The moment the money crossed into the United States banking system under Marcus' sole corporate liability, it became eligible for immediate federal seizure. Preston set his champagne flute down on the mahogany desk. He cracked his knuckles and placed his hands over the keyboard. He told Marcus to get ready to go downstairs and make the biggest speech of his life. Preston hit the execute button. The screen displayed a small spinning loading wheel. For exactly 4 seconds, the suite was completely silent, save for the hum of the air conditioning. Then the screen flashed a bright, vibrant green. The words "Transaction Successful" appeared in bold white letters across the center of the monitor. The $50 million had officially landed in the domestic charity account. The money was completely washed. Marcus let out a loud, victorious shout. He slammed his glass against Preston's glass in a celebratory toast, splashing expensive champagne onto the polished wood. They had done it. They had stolen millions from the United States military, and they had gotten away with it completely undetected. Marcus turned toward the door, ready to head down to the ballroom and claim his throne. But Preston did not follow him. Preston was staring down at the silver laptop. The vibrant green screen had suddenly started to flicker. The bright, cheerful light died, instantly plunging the monitor into a stark pitch black. Marcus stopped at the door and asked Preston what was wrong. Preston did not answer. His hands were hovering over the keyboard, trembling violently. He frantically tapped the keys, trying to refresh the page, but the system was completely unresponsive. A single line of text slowly typed itself across the center of the black screen. The letters were a harsh, glowing crimson red, illuminating Preston's terrified face. Preston read the words out loud, his voice dropping to a breathless, horrified whisper. Assets under the exclusive control of the United States federal government. While my mother and sister were in a luxury hotel suite sipping expensive champagne and zipping themselves into custom couture gowns, I was standing in the absolute silence of a secure federal safe house. They were busy painting their faces with expensive makeup, preparing to step onto a glittering stage at the Ritz-Carlton to announce their fraudulent community initiative. They believed they were untouchable. They believed their proximity to Preston and his white venture capital money had elevated them to the absolute highest tier of Atlanta society. They thought they had successfully discarded me like a broken toy. They had no idea that I was preparing for the exact same event, but my preparation looked vastly different from theirs. I walked into the dimly lit bedroom of the safe house. The air conditioning hummed a steady low note against the oppressive summer heat waiting outside the walls. Hanging on the back of the solid oak door was a heavy black canvas garment bag. I did not buy a silk evening gown for tonight. I did not hire a stylist to curl my hair or drape my neck in stolen diamonds. I unzipped the canvas bag and pulled out my formal military dress uniform. The dark blue fabric was immaculate. It was pressed to absolute perfection without a single crease or flaw. I put the uniform on methodically, piece by piece. The crisp white shirt felt like a layer of armor against my skin. The heavy dark blue jacket settled onto my shoulders, carrying the weight and the profound dignity of the United States Army Criminal Investigation Division. I walked over to the wooden dresser and opened a velvet-lined box. Inside, resting on black satin, were my military commendations. I picked them up one at a time and pinned them securely to the left side of my chest. I fastened the Meritorious Service Medal. I attached the Army Commendation Medal. I pinned the National Defense Service Medal. Every single piece of polished metal represented years of grueling sacrifice and unwavering discipline. They were not handed to me by a corrupt politician. They were not bought with dirty money laundered through offshore shell companies. They were earned through blood, sweat, and an absolute commitment to justice. As I fastened the shining gold oak leaves to my shoulders, signifying my formal rank as a major, I felt a profound sense of absolute clarity wash over my entire body. My family had always mocked my military career. My mother Beatrice used to tell her wealthy friends that I joined the army because I lacked the sophistication to succeed in the corporate world. Chloe used to laugh at my tactical boots and my rigid schedule, calling me a masculine disappointment who would never attract a high-value man. They worshipped the illusion of wealth while completely despising the reality of hard work. They loved the shiny corporate facade Marcus provided, but they hated the strict moral code I lived by. Looking at my reflection in the full-length mirror, I realized how perfectly poetic this moment truly was. The very institution they had mocked my entire life was about to be the exact instrument of their total destruction. I was no longer Valerie the discarded wife or the scapegoat daughter. I was Major Valerie Jenkins, and I was the executioner of their fraudulent empire. I turned away from the mirror and walked out into the small living area of the safe house. Sitting on the corner of a basic wooden desk was one of the few personal items my tactical team had managed to retrieve from the Buckhead estate before Marcus had illegally changed the security codes. It was our official wedding portrait framed in heavy brushed silver. I picked the heavy frame up and stared at the glossy photograph. Marcus was looking at the camera, flashing his signature charismatic $1,000,000 smile. He looked like the perfect loving husband. I was wearing a delicate white lace gown, looking up at him with complete and absolute trust. Standing directly in the background were my mother and Chloe, wearing matching pastel dresses and beaming with pride. It was a masterclass in deception captured in high-definition photography. I traced my thumb over the cold glass covering Marcus' face. I remembered the vows he had spoken to me that day. I remembered how my mother had pulled me aside at the reception and told me I had finally done something right by marrying a man with such a bright, lucrative future. I realize now that they never actually loved me. They only loved the stability and the respectable cover story I provided while they quietly built their criminal house of cards. They used my clean military background to make Marcus look like a respectable family man. And the moment I became a threat to their money laundering operation, they discarded me without a single second of hesitation. I did not feel any lingering heartbreak as I looked at the photograph. I did not feel any sorrow or grief for the marriage I had lost. The woman in that picture, the naive, trusting wife, was completely dead. I raised my hand and held the silver frame out over the metal trash can resting beside the desk. I opened my fingers and simply let go. The heavy frame hit the bottom of the metal can and the glass shattered instantly. The sharp, violent sound of the breaking glass echoed loudly through the quiet room. It was the sound of a completely severed tie. I did not look down at the broken pieces. The past was dead and I had absolutely zero intention of looking back. I walked over to the kitchen counter and picked up my secure federal communication device. I inserted the molded tactical earpiece into my right ear. The secure channel clicked open immediately with a soft burst of static. The voice of the FBI tactical lead came through crisp, professional, and ready for action. He informed me that all perimeter units were officially locked in position around the Ritz-Carlton. He confirmed that the plainclothes agents had secured all ballroom exits and service elevators. He then delivered the best news I had heard all month. He confirmed that the financial cyber trap had been fully triggered in the penthouse suite. Preston and Marcus had taken the bait perfectly. They were currently locked in their luxury suite, staring at a frozen computer screen, realizing their $50 million transfer had just been seized by the United States government. The panic was finally setting in. I pressed the communication button on my collar and told the tactical lead that I was on my way. I smoothed out the front of my dark blue uniform jacket, ensuring every button was aligned perfectly. I adjusted my service cap, placing it squarely on my head. I did not need a grand entrance on a red carpet. I did not need flashing cameras from society photographers to validate my existence. I walked to the front door of the safe house and pulled the heavy steel deadbolt back. I stepped out into the thick, humid evening air. The Atlanta night was heavy with the promise of a massive summer thunderstorm. The sky above the city skyline was dark and bruised. Exactly as I stepped onto the sidewalk, a massive black armored military SUV pulled up directly to the curb in front of me. The heavy diesel engine rumbled with a deep, threatening vibration that rattled the pavement beneath my boots. The tinted window of the front passenger seat rolled down just an inch, revealing the face of a heavily armed federal agent. He looked at me and gave a single silent nod, confirming that the extraction team was ready to move. I reached out and pulled open the heavy ballistic steel door of the rear passenger compartment. I climbed inside the vehicle and settled into the dark leather seat. The heavy door slammed shut behind me, sealing me inside the mobile tactical fortress. I looked straight ahead at the dark privacy partition separating me from the driver. I took one final deep breath, letting the cold air conditioning fill my lungs. I told the driver to take me directly to the Ritz-Carlton. It was time to crash the party and burn their false empire to the ground. The grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton was a masterclass in manufactured prestige. Even from the service corridor where I stood waiting, I could hear the booming jazz band and the endless clinking of crystal champagne flutes. Through the crack in the heavy service doors, I had a perfect view of the stage. The entire space was drenched in golden light, reflecting off the massive chandeliers hanging from the vaulted ceiling. Hundreds of Atlanta's wealthiest politicians, real estate developers, and social elite were gathered in their finest evening wear. They were completely captivated by the brilliant performance happening at the front of the room. Preston was standing at the center podium holding the microphone and playing the role of the generous white savior to absolute perfection. He was wearing a bespoke tuxedo, smiling warmly at the crowd as camera flashes illuminated his face. He was delivering a passionate speech about the necessity of empowering the Black community. He spoke about lifting up marginalized voices and investing in the diverse future of the city. He was using all the right buzzwords, wrapping his massive federal theft in the language of social justice and equity. Marcus was standing right next to him, playing the token success story exactly as he had been instructed. He was beaming for the cameras, nodding along with every single word Preston said. Chloe was standing on the other side of Preston, draped in the stolen cartel diamonds, looking out at the crowd with an expression of pure, unadulterated triumph. They were entirely intoxicated by the applause. They thought they had finally reached the absolute pinnacle of high society. I stood in the shadows of the corridor, flanked by two plainclothes federal agents. I took one final breath, letting the cold air clear my lungs. I gave the agents a single sharp nod. They pushed the massive mahogany double doors wide open. The heavy doors hit the wall with a loud, resounding thud that cut right through the smooth jazz playing in the corner. I did not sneak into the room. I walked directly into the center aisle. The sharp, precise click of my polished tactical boots against the marble entrance gave way to the soft thud of the plush red carpet. The dark blue fabric of my military dress uniform stood out violently against the sea of pastel silk gowns and tailored tuxedos. The gleaming gold oak leaves on my shoulders and the rows of polished commendation medals on my chest caught the bright light of the chandeliers. I was not walking like a discarded wife. I was marching with the full, terrifying authority of the United States government. The reaction in the room was immediate and visceral. The lively chatter died instantly. The clinking of glasses ceased. The crowd parted instinctively, pulling back to create a wide, clear path straight down the center aisle toward the stage. They did not know who I was, but they recognized absolute power when it walked into a room. The air in the ballroom grew thick with sudden, heavy tension. Up on the stage, Marcus saw me first. The charismatic million-dollar smile melted off his face instantly. The blood drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking hollow and gray. He took a physical step backward, actually bumping into the wooden podium. Preston stopped speaking mid-sentence. His voice echoed through the microphone for a fraction of a second before dying out completely. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a sudden flickering panic. He realized right then that I was not wearing civilian clothes. He realized I had not been stripped of my rank. Chloe gripped Preston's arm, her jaw dropping open in sheer horror. She tried to whisper something to him, but no words came out. From the VIP tables near the front of the stage, my mother Beatrice sprang into action. She was wearing a custom emerald green gown dripping with expensive pearls. Her face twisted into a mask of pure panic and desperate rage. She saw her perfect illusion crumbling before her very eyes, and she reverted to her only defense mechanism. She tried to control me. She marched directly into the center aisle, moving quickly to block my path to the stage. Her face was flushed dark red. She started hissing at me in a harsh, frantic whisper, demanding to know what I was doing. She ordered me to turn around and leave the hotel immediately before I ruined their night. She told me I was a disgrace and an embarrassment. She raised her hand, preparing to grab my arm and physically pull me toward the exit. I did not slow my pace. I did not break my stride for a single millisecond. I looked right through her as if she were made of thin, invisible glass. Just as her hand reached out to grab my uniform sleeve, I stepped seamlessly to the side, evading her grasp entirely. I walked right past her without acknowledging her existence by a single word or a single glance. It was the ultimate, absolute dismissal. I treated the woman who had given birth to me like a minor, insignificant obstacle on the floor. She was left standing entirely alone in the middle of the aisle, her hand grasping at empty air. She sputtered and gasped, humiliated in front of the entire Atlanta elite. She looked around frantically, realizing that hundreds of powerful people had just watched her get completely and totally ignored by a high-ranking military officer. I reached the carpeted stairs leading up to the main stage. I climbed them with deliberate, heavy steps, keeping my eyes locked dead on Preston. Marcus was completely paralyzed. He was sweating profusely, his chest heaving under his expensive tuxedo jacket. He knew the federal net had finally dropped. Preston tried desperately to recover his composure. He forced a tight, nervous smile onto his face, attempting to play the role of the confident host. He probably thought he could charm his way out of this or play my arrival off as a surprise guest appearance to honor the military. He puffed out his chest and opened his mouth, preparing to speak into the microphone to diffuse the crushing tension in the room. I did not wait for him to utter a single syllable. I walked directly up to the podium, closing the distance until I was standing merely inches away from him. I looked him dead in his cold, arrogant eyes. I reached out and ripped the microphone straight out of his hand. The microphone let out a sharp, piercing whine as I ripped it from Preston's grip. The sudden feedback echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the Ritz-Carlton ballroom, causing several guests in the front row to physically flinch and cover their ears. I stepped directly into the center of the podium. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream. I spoke with the calm, terrifying cadence of a military prosecutor who already had the jury, the judge, and the executioner in her pocket. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," I said. My voice projected effortlessly across the massive, silent room. "My name is Major Valerie Jenkins of the United States Army Criminal Investigation Division. You were invited here tonight to witness the launch of a $50 million community investment initiative. You were told this money would build neighborhoods and empower minority businesses. I am here to inform you that you are actually serving as background extras in a federal money laundering operation." A collective gasp rippled through the hundreds of wealthy guests. Politicians and socialites exchanged horrified glances. Preston lunged forward, trying to grab the microphone back. "Valerie, have you lost your mind?" he hissed, his face pale with panic. "Security, get her off this stage right now." I stepped to the side, effortlessly evading his grasp. I reached into my uniform pocket and pulled out a small black remote. I pressed a single button. The massive high-definition LED screen suspended behind the stage had been displaying the golden logo of the Vanguard of the Future charity. The moment I pressed the button, the golden logo vanished. It was instantly replaced by a stark black background, projecting high-contrast financial routing documents. The text was massive, impossible for anyone in the room to miss. I directed the attention of the room to the screens. I explained exactly what they were looking at. I pointed to the red, highlighted transaction lines showing $45 million being siphoned directly from a Department of Defense veteran housing grant. I showed the crowd how the money was routed through 7 different shell companies, all legally registered under the sole name of my husband, Marcus. Marcus staggered backward. He looked up at the screens and his jaw dropped open. He raised his hands in a frantic, pleading gesture. "Valerie, please," he begged, his voice cracking over the sound system. "You know I did not do this alone. You know Preston set up those accounts." I looked down at the man I had once promised to spend my life with. "You are absolutely right, Marcus," I said, my tone dropping to ice. "Preston did set them up. But 3 weeks ago, you brought your high-priced attorney to the Fulton County Courthouse. You forced me to sign a legally binding divorce decree where you explicitly claimed sole ownership and 100% liability for every single one of those specific funds. You legally absolved Preston of the corporate liability, and you legally absolved me. You built the gallows, and you put your own neck in the rope. Marcus' legs gave out. He stumbled and fell hard to his knees right there on the carpeted stage. He looked frantically toward the service doors, trying to find an escape route. He scrambled to his feet and made a desperate dash for the exit. He made it exactly 10 yards before 4 massive men in catering uniforms stepped directly into his path. They did not hold trays of champagne. They unbuttoned their vests, revealing tactical holsters and federal badges. Marcus froze, completely trapped. I turned my attention back to Preston. Preston was sweating profusely now. His arrogant white savior persona was disintegrating under the bright stage lights. He looked out at the sea of prominent black investors and politicians who were now staring at him with absolute disgust. "This is a complete fabrication," Preston shouted desperately, pointing a finger at me. "This woman is a disgruntled, suspended soldier. She fabricated these documents out of pure jealousy. We are building an empire for this community. We love this community." I pressed the button on my remote a second time. The financial documents on the screens vanished. They were replaced by a single audio waveform graphic. "You love this community, Preston," I asked. "Let us see exactly how much you love the people in this room." I hit play. The pristine acoustics of the ballroom amplified the audio recording perfectly. It was a wiretapped phone call between Preston and his offshore accountant recorded just 2 days ago. Preston's voice echoed clearly and undeniably across the silent crowd. "They are just stupid black puppets," Preston's voice sneered from the speakers. "Marcus is a convenient face. The mother is a degenerate gambler I can buy with spare change. As long as I keep handing them shiny things and telling them they are part of the elite, they will sign whatever I put in front of them. The federal government will never audit a minority fund. It is the perfect shield. I am using their desperation for status to wash $50 million, and they are too ignorant to even realize I am holding the leash." The recording stopped. The silence in the ballroom was so heavy it felt suffocating. The elite members of Atlanta high society were staring at Preston with a collective burning fury. He had not just stolen from the government. He had mocked their entire community. He had used their fight for representation as a cheap mask for his corporate greed. Chloe let out a sharp, horrified scream. She was standing just a few feet away from Preston, clutching the sides of her designer gown. She looked at her husband with absolute revulsion. "How could you?" she shrieked, her voice breaking. "You told me we were partners. You told me you respected my family." I turned to my older sister. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for her. "Chloe," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the microphone, "do you really want to know what your husband considers a partnership? Look at the screen." I pressed the remote for the 3rd time. The audio graphic disappeared. The massive screens lit up with high-resolution surveillance photographs. They were pictures of Marcus and Amanda, Preston young white executive assistant. They were kissing in the lobby of an Aspen ski resort. They were walking hand in hand onto a private jet. Chloe let out a guttural, devastating sob. She recognized the dates on the photographs. But I was not finished. I clicked to the next slide. It showed a series of internal corporate emails between Preston and Amanda. "Read the emails, Chloe," I commanded. "Preston did not just know about your brother-in-law having an affair. Preston orchestrated it. He ordered his assistant to sleep with Marcus to keep him distracted while he restructured the legal bylaws. Your husband paid his assistant a massive bonus to destroy my marriage just so he could secure his money laundering operation. And the diamond necklace you are wearing right now, the one you have been bragging about all evening, that was purchased with cartel money Preston washed through Marcus' accounts. You are wearing federal evidence around your neck." Chloe's eyes went wide with sheer terror. She looked down at the massive diamonds resting against her collarbone as if they were suddenly burning her skin. She reached up and frantically clawed at the clasp, desperate to get the jewelry off her body. The necklace snapped, and the heavy diamonds crashed to the wooden stage. Chloe lunged forward. She raised her hand and slapped Preston across the face with a force that echoed like a gunshot. Preston stumbled backward, holding his reddening cheek. From the floor just below the stage, my mother Beatrice let out a loud, agonizing wail. She crawled forward, gripping the edge of the stage. Her perfect emerald gown was bunched up around her knees. Her makeup was smeared with tears. "Valerie, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "Stop this. You have proven your point. You have ruined them. But please, you have to stop before you destroy the house. Preston promised me the house was safe." I looked down at the woman who had birthed me. The woman who had allowed a man to beat her and then ordered me to drop the charges just to protect her false social status. "You think your house is safe, Mom?" I asked, my voice steady and completely void of emotion. I pressed the remote one final time. The screens shifted to display a series of property deeds and bank foreclosures. "Preston did not pay off your gambling debts out of the kindness of his heart," I explained, looking directly down into her terrified eyes. "He used your debts to blackmail you into signing away the equity of your home. He used your property as the collateral baseline to open the phantom funds. You signed the paperwork without reading it because you were too busy trying to impress his wealthy friends. When I froze the offshore accounts an hour ago, the bank automatically triggered the default clauses on the collateral. Your house is gone, Mom. Everything you thought you owned was just a mirage. You sold your own daughter out to protect an empire that never actually existed. And now you have absolutely nothing." Beatrice let out a harrowing, devastating scream. She clutched her chest, gasping for air as the total reality of her ruin crashed down upon her. She collapsed onto the carpeted floor, weeping uncontrollably into her hands. Preston straightened his jacket. He wiped a drop of blood from the corner of his mouth where Chloe had struck him. He looked around the room at the federal agents securing the doors and the furious crowd surrounding the stage. He realized he was cornered, but his overwhelming white privilege and deeply ingrained arrogance refused to let him surrender. He still believed the rules did not apply to him. He let out a short, bitter laugh. He reached into the inside pocket of his tuxedo jacket and pulled out his cell phone. "You think you are so smart, Valerie," he sneered, pointing the phone at me. "You think a little slideshow is going to put me in prison? You are a suspended military officer. I have the most powerful politicians in the state of Georgia on my payroll. I am making one phone call to Senator Davis, and he is going to have you arrested for treason before you can even walk out of this hotel." Preston tapped the screen and held the phone up high, switching it to speakerphone so the entire silent ballroom could hear his ultimate trump card. The phone rang twice. A deep, gruff voice answered the line. Preston smiled triumphantly. "Senator Davis," he said, his voice dripping with false confidence. "I have a rogue military officer staging a domestic terrorism event at the Ritz-Carlton. I need you to contact the Pentagon immediately and authorize a tactical strike." The voice on the other end of the line sighed heavily. "I am sorry to disappoint you, sir," the voice replied, the audio carrying perfectly over Preston's speakerphone. "But this is Special Agent Miller with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Senator Davis cannot take your call right now. We placed the senator under federal arrest for corruption and conspiracy exactly 10 minutes ago." Preston's phone slipped from his trembling fingers and hit the wooden stage with a hollow clatter. The dead silence in the grand ballroom shattered. Panic erupted like a match dropped into gasoline. The elite investors and politicians, who had just been clapping for Preston, now scrambled backward, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive center of the room. I did not give Preston a single second to recover. I raised my hand and gave a sharp tactical nod to the back of the room. The execution was flawless. All around the perimeter of the ballroom, the impeccably dressed catering staff suddenly moved in perfect lethal synchronization. They dropped their silver champagne trays onto the carpeted floor. In one fluid motion, 24 waiters and bartenders ripped off their formal black vests, revealing the bold yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation printed across dark tactical body armor. They drew their service weapons simultaneously. The sharp metallic clacks of handguns being racked echoed over the rising screams of the crowd. "Federal agents, nobody move!" the command thundered from the lead agent, cutting through the chaos. Marcus let out a pathetic, terrified whimper. He scrambled backward on his hands and knees, trying to crawl away from the stage. He did not make it 3 feet. Two undercover agents vaulted onto the platform and tackled him to the floor. The heavy impact drove the breath from his lungs. They shoved his face hard into the plush red carpet, pinning his arms behind his back. The custom-tailored velvet jacket he was so proud of tore at the shoulder as cold steel handcuffs snapped violently around his wrists. He was sobbing now, begging the agents to listen to him, swearing that he was just an innocent frontman. The agents ignored every word. Preston's reaction was entirely different. His deeply ingrained arrogance simply refused to accept reality. When the FBI agents grabbed his arms, he actually tried to shove them away. He puffed out his chest and started screaming about his constitutional rights and his team of elite lawyers. He threatened to sue every single officer in the room. He screamed that they were making a catastrophic mistake arresting a man of his financial stature. The lead agent did not flinch. He grabbed Preston by the back of his expensive tuxedo collar and swept his legs out from under him. Preston hit the wooden stage face first with a sickening thud. The agent pressed a heavy tactical boot directly between Preston's shoulder blades, driving him flat against the floorboards. "You have the right to remain silent," the agent said, his voice devoid of any emotion as he ratcheted the handcuffs tight across Preston's wrists. "I highly suggest you start using it." Chloe was completely paralyzed. She stood mere feet away from her husband, watching him get treated like a common street criminal. The broken pieces of the cartel diamond necklace lay scattered around her designer heels. She was trembling violently, her hands covering her mouth as she realized the absolute totality of her ruin. The pristine, wealthy life she had weaponized against me was entirely fabricated. She was married to a monster who had used her family as a disposable shield, and now she had absolutely nothing left to brag about. From the floor below the stage, the sound of frantic scrambling caught my attention. My mother Beatrice was dragging herself up the short flight of carpeted stairs. Her emerald green couture gown was ruined, stained with spilled wine, and trampled by the panicked crowd. She was hyperventilating, her eyes wide and wild with absolute desperation. She ignored Marcus. She ignored Preston. She bypassed Chloe entirely. She crawled directly toward me. She reached out with shaking hands and grabbed the dark blue fabric of my uniform trousers. She gripped my pant legs so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Valerie, please," she sobbed, staring up at me with tears streaming down her ruined makeup. "Please, you have to stop them. You have the power to stop this. Tell them it is a misunderstanding. Tell them Preston was going to fix the mortgage. You cannot let them take the house, Valerie. It is the only thing I have left. I am your mother. You cannot leave me with nothing." I looked down at the woman gripping my uniform. I looked at the white bandage still wrapped around her forehead, the bandage covering the wound my husband gave her with a baseball bat. I remembered standing in the police precinct begging her to tell the truth. I remembered her looking me dead in the eye and ordering me to surrender my military badge just to protect her false social status. She was not crying because her family was involved in a federal crime. She was not crying because she realized how terribly she had treated me. She was crying because the bank was going to take her mansion. I felt no anger anymore. I felt no sorrow. I felt nothing but a profound, absolute emptiness toward her. I slowly reached down. I grabbed her wrists. Her hands were cold and clammy. I peeled her fingers off my uniform one by one with deliberate mechanical precision. I stepped back, physically separating myself from her grasp. "You made your choice at the police station, Mom," I said. My voice was calm, level, and completely devoid of pity. It carried clearly over her frantic sobbing. "You chose to protect a man who beat you because he promised you a life of luxury. You chose to participate in a federal fraud because you wanted to feel superior to your own community. You sold your own daughter for a house built on stolen money." But Valerie, she choked out, reaching for me again. "We are blood. We are family." I looked at her with eyes as cold as winter ice. "The law has no place for fake family ties, ma'am," I said. I turned my back on her. I did not look at Marcus writhing on the floor in handcuffs. I did not look at Preston getting dragged to his feet by federal agents. I did not look at Chloe weeping over her shattered diamonds. I simply adjusted my uniform jacket, ensuring my medals were perfectly aligned. I walked down the stairs of the stage and stepped back into the center aisle. The crowd of stunned guests parted for me immediately. Nobody said a word. Nobody dared to breathe in my direction. The path to the exit was completely clear. The heavy wooden doors of the ballroom stood wide open. I marched straight toward them. The frantic, desperate screams of my mother calling my name echoed behind me, bouncing off the crystal chandeliers and fading into the chaotic noise of the arrests. I did not break my stride. I did not pause. I did not look back. I stepped through the doors and walked out into the grand lobby of the Ritz-Carlton, leaving the wreckage of their fraudulent empire entirely in my wake. The heavy air conditioning of the hotel gave way to the thick, warm breeze as I pushed through the revolving glass doors and stepped out into the Atlanta night. The storm that had been brewing all evening had finally broken. The rain had washed the city streets clean, leaving the pavement slick and reflecting the glowing neon lights of the downtown skyline. The air smelled fresh and sharp. My armored military SUV was waiting at the curb exactly where I left it. The driver stood at attention, opening the heavy ballistic steel door for me. I paused for just a moment before climbing inside. I looked up at the dark, quiet sky stretching infinitely above the towering skyscrapers. I took a long, slow breath, letting the cool, damp air fill my lungs completely. The crushing weight of their expectations, their manipulation, and their relentless abuse was finally gone. I had dismantled the cage they built around me, and I had used their own arrogant hands to do it. I felt a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of vengeance or malice. It was the pure, radiant smile of a woman who had fought a war for her own soul and emerged totally, completely free. I climbed into the back of the SUV. The heavy door slammed shut, sealing out the noise of the city. I leaned back into the dark leather seat and closed my eyes. The nightmare was officially over. My life was finally mine.